Hi, my name is Michael, and this is Old Vegas Legends. One night in Las Vegas, a man sat down at a blackjack table, played until the sun came up, and won so much money that the MGM Grand, one of the most powerful casino operations on Earth, had to make an emergency phone call and wire in cash just to keep the game going. That man was not a card shark. He was not a professional gambler. He was an Australian media billionaire named Kerry Packer, and he was the single most dangerous recreational gambler Las Vegas had ever seen. This is his story. Before the money, the boy who inherited a curse. To understand what Kerry Packer became, you have to understand what Kerry Packer survived. I want to be upfront with you here. I went down such a deep rabbit hole on the early life of Kerry Packer that my wife had to physically take my laptop away from me at midnight. Because once you start reading about this man's childhood, you cannot stop. Not because it is glamorous, because it is devastating. Kerry Francis Bullmore Packer was born on December 17, 1937 in Sydney, Australia. His father was Sir Frank Packer, newspaper magnate, power broker, one of the most feared men in Australian public life. By the time Kerry arrived, the Packer family was already a dynasty, already wealthy, already connected to the highest levels of Australian government and business. From the outside, Kerry Packer was born with every advantage a person could have. From the inside, it was a different story entirely. Frank Packer was a tyrant, not a complicated, conflicted patriarch who loved his children, but showed it badly. A tyrant. He beat Kerry. He humiliated him in front of staff, in front of family, in front of anyone who happened to be nearby when the mood struck. He told Kerry repeatedly in plain language that he was worthless, that he was stupid, that he would never amount to anything. Part of what Frank was responding to was Kerry's dyslexia. Kerry struggled profoundly with reading and writing as a child, at a time when dyslexia was not understood as a learning difference. It was just seen as a defect, a failure of intelligence or effort. Frank Packer had no patience for defects. Kerry's older brother Clyde was Frank's favorite, articulate, polished, socially smooth. Everything Frank wanted in an heir. And Frank made sure Kerry knew exactly where he ranked. Here's a detail that I personally think is the most underrated part of this entire story, and people almost always skip past it when they tell Kerry Packer's life. The psychological violence of Kerry's childhood did not break him. It twisted him into something else entirely. It made him pathologically competitive, pathologically driven to prove himself, pathologically incapable of backing down from any challenge, at the negotiating table, in the boardroom, or at a blackjack table in Las Vegas at 3 in the morning. Every single one of those qualities traces directly back to a father who looked his son in the eye and told him he was nothing. Kerry Packer spent his entire adult life answering that verdict. He attended Geelong Grammar School, one of Australia's most prestigious private schools. Then he went to work for his father's company. It was not because Frank welcomed him. It was because the alternative was irrelevance, and Kerry Packer would accept anything in life before he accepted irrelevance. He started at the bottom of his father's media empire and learned the business from the floor up. Quietly, without anyone paying much attention, he became very, very good at it. The Packer Empire, print, power, and fear. Sir Frank Packer had built Consolidated Press Holdings into the most powerful media company in Australia. Newspapers, magazines, television. If Australians were reading it or watching it in the 1950s and 60s, there was a reasonable chance Frank Packer owned it. The crown jewel was the Nine Network, Australia's most watched television network. Frank had built it, nurtured it, and protected it with the kind of territorial ferocity that only men who build things from nothing ever really have. And Frank had decided, for most of Kerry's life, that Kerry was not the one to inherit it. Then, Frank got sick. And on his deathbed, Frank Packer did something that contained multitudes. He left the empire to Kerry, not Clyde. Kerry. The reasons have been debated for decades. Some said Frank finally saw something in Kerry he'd missed. Some said it was a last act of spite toward Clyde. Some said Frank simply recognized in those final lucid moments that Kerry had the killer instinct the business required. Clyde was too nice, too refined, too comfortable. Kerry wasn't any of those things. What Frank said to Kerry in those final conversations, the specific words, have never been fully confirmed. But the version that has circulated through Australian business circles for 40 years goes something like this. Frank told Kerry the inheritance wasn't a gift, it was a test, and that he still wasn't sure Kerry was up to it. Even dying, Frank Packer couldn't give his son an uncomplicated moment of love. Kerry inherited the empire in 1974, and what he did with it would rewrite Australian media history. Kerry takes the throne and rewrites the rules. Kerry Packer was not his father. He was louder, physically larger. He stood well over 6 feet and carried the kind of presence that made rooms rearrange themselves around him. He was crude where Frank had been patrician, blunt where Frank had been calculated. He had no interest in being liked and every interest in winning. He modernized consolidated press holdings. He understood television in a way Frank never fully had. He transformed the Nine Network into the dominant force in Australian broadcasting. He introduced World Series cricket in 1977, essentially hijacking the sport by signing the world's best players to his own private competition when Cricket Australia refused to let him broadcast test matches on his network. The establishment was outraged. The public was riveted. Kerry won. But the deal that defines Kerry Packer's business legacy, the one that still gets taught in MBA programs, happened in 1987. Kerry sold the Nine Network to Alan Bond for $1 billion. $1 billion. At the time, it was the largest media transaction in Australian history. People thought Kerry had lost his mind. The Nine Network was the jewel. You didn't sell the jewel. Kerry took the money. Then Alan Bond's empire collapsed. Because it turns out Alan Bond was running on debt and optimism in roughly equal measure, and when the music stopped, there was nothing underneath him. The Nine Network went into receivership, and Kerry Packer bought it back. In 1990, Kerry reacquired the Nine Network for approximately $250 million. He'd sold it for $1 billion. He bought it back for a fraction of that. His famous quote about that transaction, and I love this because it is the most perfectly Kerry Packer thing any human being has ever said, was this: "You only get one Alan Bond in your lifetime, and I've had mine." That's not a businessman talking. That's a man who grew up being told he was stupid, watching the scoreboard and laughing. Kerry Packer ran his businesses through a combination of genuine strategic brilliance and raw intimidation. He had no time for bureaucracy, no patience for people who could not get to the point, and no tolerance for being told something could not be done. His executives lived in a state of productive terror. His competitors lived in a state of unproductive terror. And the Australian government, when they came after him in the 1991 Senate inquiry over his tax arrangements, got a response so withering and confident that Kerry effectively told the entire Australian Parliament to go educate themselves about how business worked. He was that kind of man. The gambling obsession, not a hobby, a hunger. Now here is where the story gets to what you came for. Kerry Packer's gambling was not a quirk. It was not a rich man's hobby, the way some billionaires collect yachts or race horses. It was a hunger, and I think it connected directly to everything we have already talked about. Kerry Packer spent his childhood being told the odds were against him. His entire adult life was a compulsive need to sit down across from those odds and beat them. His game was blackjack, specifically high-stakes blackjack, the game where the house edge is smallest, and where, if you know what you are doing, you can get the margin down to almost nothing. Kerry knew what he was doing. He was not a card counter in the traditional sense, the kind that gets quietly removed by casino security. But he played with the discipline of a card counter. He understood basic strategy at a level most recreational players never approach. He knew exactly when to hit, when to stand, when to double down, and when to split. He played without emotion, without superstition, without any of the psychological noise that bleeds chips away from ordinary gamblers. He played with the confidence of a man who genuinely did not care whether he won or lost any particular hand, because the stakes, even at tens of thousands of dollars per hand, were not existentially threatening to him. That is the thing about Kerry Packer at a blackjack table that made casino operators simultaneously thrilled and terrified. He was not gambling with scared money. He was not gambling with money he needed. He was gambling with discretionary income at a scale that made the concept of discretionary income seem almost quaint. His typical bet at the blackjack table was somewhere between $100,000 and $300,000 per hand. He would play multiple hands simultaneously. Do the arithmetic on what a single shoe of cards means at that level, and you understand very quickly why the MGM Grand had to make a phone call. His attitude toward losing was equally remarkable. He lost millions without visible distress, not because he was suppressing emotion, but because he had done the calculation and accepted the variance. He came to Vegas to play. He knew the game. He accepted the math. And on the nights the math ran his way, it ran in a direction that broke casinos. Kerry comes to Las Vegas, and Vegas has never seen anything like him. Kerry Packer's relationship with Las Vegas began in earnest in the late 1980s and deepened through the 1990s. By the time he became a regular, Vegas had already seen high rollers. The desert was built on high rollers. The whole infrastructure of comps and suites and private jets and personal hosts existed because casinos understood that one whale could generate more revenue in a weekend than 1,000 regular players generated in a month. But Kerry Packer was not a whale in the conventional sense. A conventional whale is a player the casino courts, a player the casino manages, a player the casino keeps happy with suites and shows and excellent scotch, because the casino needs that player to keep coming back and losing. Kerry Packer was the opposite of that equation. Kerry Packer didn't need the suites. He had more money than the people giving him the suites. He didn't need the comp dinners. He could buy the restaurant. He came to Vegas on his own terms, played the way he wanted to play, and the casinos had to decide how they felt about that. And what they decided, nearly unanimously, was that they would take the risk, because the upside of having Kerry Packer at your tables on a bad night for Kerry was extraordinary. His entourage was notable. Kerry didn't travel light. He traveled with a circle of associates, bodyguards, and in later years, various companions who were there to facilitate whatever Kerry needed. He didn't like to be kept waiting. He didn't like administrative friction. If he wanted to sit down and play, he sat down and played. The casino adjusted to him. His tipping was legendary even before the big nights. Dealers who worked his table walked away with thousands of dollars in gratuities. Not because Kerry was generous in the sentimental way, because Kerry respected people who did their job well and showed it in the only currency that didn't require conversation. Casino hosts who managed his visits have given interviews over the years describing the specific atmospheric shift that happened when word spread through a casino floor that Packer was in the building. Other high rollers would drift toward whatever table he was playing. Staff would sharpen up. Pit bosses would appear from nowhere. There was something about the scale of what he was doing that made everyone around him raise their game, even if they were just watching. And then came the night that Las Vegas never forgot. The night MGM had to make an emergency call. This is the part where every single time I tell this story, I get goosebumps, and I have told it probably 100 times. The exact date has been obscured by time and by the deliberate vagueness that casinos apply to their most embarrassing operational moments. The accounts are consistent enough to build a clear picture. Kerry Packer sat down at the blackjack tables at the MGM Grand in Las Vegas, one of the largest, most capitalized casino operations in the world at the time, and he started winning. Now, blackjack has variance. Even a skilled player with optimal strategy will have losing sessions. The house edge does not disappear just because you play correctly. It just shrinks. On any given night, the cards can run hot or cold, regardless of strategy. On this particular night, they ran for Kerry Packer in a way that defied comfortable description. He was playing multiple hands simultaneously. At his standard stake, the chip movement on every single deal was measured in hundreds of thousands of dollars. And he was winning. Not just winning in the vague sense that he was up a little on the session, winning in the sense that the stacks in front of him were growing at a rate that began to create a logistical problem for the casino. Let's talk about that logistical problem, because I want you to understand what it actually means for a casino cage to run short of cash. The cage is the financial nerve center of a casino operation. It holds the cash reserves needed to pay out winners, exchange chips, and keep the floor running. A major Las Vegas casino on a busy night might hold tens of millions of dollars in its cage at any given time. The MGM Grand was not a small operation. They were capitalized for heavy action. But Kerry Packer's action was heavier than their cage could comfortably absorb. The accounts of what happened that night vary in the specific numbers. This is Vegas, and nobody volunteers information that makes them look operationally embarrassed. The range that appears consistently across multiple sources: casino veterans, journalists, and people who were present places Kerry Packer's winnings from that session, somewhere between $20 million and $33 million. Some accounts push higher. I'll be honest, when I first came across this, I was convinced it could not possibly be true. I had to go verify it myself. The more sources I found, the more consistent the core of the story became. The MGM Grand had to make an emergency call. They had to wire in additional funds to cover what Kerry Packer had taken from their tables. Read that again. One of the largest casino companies on the planet had to call for backup because a single recreational player broke their cage. The wire transfer, the emergency phone call to MGM's financial operations, the logistics of moving that much cash quickly enough to keep the game going. The casino executives on the floor that night watching their chip inventory move in a direction they had no protocol for. That is not a gambling story. That is a story about what happens when one human being's resources and one human being's nerve are so far outside normal parameters that the entire system built to contain them simply cannot keep up. Kerry, by all accounts, was calm throughout. He played his hands. He made his decisions. He collected his winnings with the same emotional neutrality he brought to everything. He was not crowing. He was not performing. He was just playing blackjack at a level that happened to require emergency financial intervention from one of the most powerful gaming corporations in the world. That's Kerry Packer. What MGM did next, and what it tells you about power. Here's what I find endlessly fascinating about the aftermath of that night. And most people gloss over this part, but I think it's secretly the whole point of everything. The MGM Grand didn't bar Kerry Packer. They didn't quietly ask him not to come back. They didn't implement some new policy designed to limit his access to their tables. They invited him back. Because the mathematics of Kerry Packer as a casino customer worked in both directions. Yes, he could win $30 million in a single night, but he could also lose $30 million in a single night. And across the full arc of his time in Las Vegas, the casinos that hosted him understood that the variance ran both ways. Kerry Packer was not a winning player in the sense that a card counter is a winning player, someone gaming the system. exploiting an edge that the casino can't legally fight back against. Kerry Packer was a skilled recreational gambler, playing within the rules at such enormous scale that the normal risk management assumptions simply didn't apply. Casino executives who dealt with him in those years have been relatively candid in interviews about the internal conversations that followed nights like the MGM session. What do you do when one player can single-handedly affect your quarterly earnings? The answer the industry landed on was essentially this: you accept it as the cost of the game. If you want to be in the business of high-stakes gambling, you have to be prepared for the full range of outcomes. Kerry Packer was the full range of outcomes in human form. What did change, quietly, in the years following Packer's most dramatic sessions was the internal risk protocols at several major Las Vegas properties. Table limits were quietly reviewed. Cage capitalization was reconsidered. The scenarios that risk managers were asked to plan for expanded to include, at least implicitly, the kind of single-player exposure that Kerry Packer had demonstrated was possible. He didn't just win money from MGM that night. He forced an entire industry to update its assumptions. That is a particular kind of power, not the power of violence or politics or inherited authority. The power of someone who forces a system to rewrite its rules simply by existing within it at maximum intensity. The other Kerry Packer Vegas legends, because one story is never enough. The MGM night is the centerpiece, but it would be a disservice to Kerry Packer's casino legacy to leave it there. The stories accumulated around this man like barnacles on a ship hull, and each one shares the same quality: the quality of being almost too perfect to be true, and then turning out to be documented. The most famous supporting story involves a Texan at a casino. The specific property varies depending on who is telling it, who was loudly boasting at the craps table. Big Texan energy. He was telling anyone within earshot how much he was worth, how much he was betting, how successful he was, the kind of performance that Las Vegas sees constantly and mostly ignores. Kerry Packer happened to be nearby. He listened to the Texan for a few minutes. Then he walked over, looked the man in the eye, and said he would flip him for it, everything he was worth. The Texan declined. Kerry walked away. That story traveled through Las Vegas casino culture for 30 years because it perfectly encapsulates what made Kerry Packer different from every other rich person who ever set foot in that city. He was not performing wealth. He was simply operating at a level where the performance of it by others was genuinely boring to him. Then, there's the cocktail waitress story, which is my personal favorite because of what it reveals about Kerry's character away from the tables. A cocktail waitress at one of the properties he frequented. The story is most commonly associated with the Bellagio, mentioned to Kerry during a conversation he had initiated that she was struggling financially and trying to buy a house. The specifics vary, but the outcome does not. Kerry Packer tipped her $1 million. $1 million to a cocktail waitress, because she was kind to him and he could. I want to be careful here, because there is a version of this story that makes Kerry Packer sound sentimental and warm, and I am not entirely sure that is accurate. What I think is more accurate is that Kerry Packer had an extremely well-developed sense of proportion. He understood value. He understood what $1 million meant to someone whose entire financial struggle he could eliminate with a single gesture that cost him, relatively speaking, almost nothing. He acted on that understanding. Whether that is warmth or just clarity of perception is a philosophical question I will leave with you. His poker games deserve their own chapter. Kerry played poker with the same strategic discipline he brought to blackjack, but poker introduced a social element that blackjack did not have. You were playing against other people, not the house. Kerry was a notoriously difficult poker opponent because he had essentially no tells. The same psychological armor that made him unreadable in business negotiations made him opaque across a felt table. People who played high-stakes poker with Kerry Packer in those years described the experience as profoundly uncomfortable. not because he was unpleasant, but because you genuinely could not get a read on him. His sessions in London at the Aspinalls and the Ritz Casino generated their own mythology. London's gaming laws were different, the culture was different, and yet Kerry Packer brought the same energy to Berkeley Square that he brought to the Las Vegas Strip. Casino managers in London gave interviews for years after his death describing the logistical challenges of managing a Packer session, emergency chip deliveries, rapid consultations with ownership, the specific controlled panic of watching your float evaporate in real time. He was, in the purest sense, a global phenomenon. The heart attack that changed everything. Almost 1990, Kerry Packer is on a polo field in Sydney. He collapses, full cardiac arrest, clinically dead for approximately 6 to 8 minutes, according to the paramedics who attended the scene. He was revived by a defibrillator. Specifically, he was revived by a defibrillator that Kerry Packer himself had donated to that polo club. This detail is almost impossibly ironic. I actually called my mom after learning this because I needed to tell someone immediately, and she was the first person I thought of. The detail felt like something a novelist would invent and then think better of because no editor would let it through. The man is saved by a machine he paid for. You could spend a week thinking about what that means and still not get to the bottom of it. Kerry recovered. When journalists and interviewers asked him what dying had been like, what those minutes of clinical death had taught him, what he had seen or felt or understood in that darkness, he gave an answer that is one of the most Kerry Packer things ever recorded. He said there was nothing there. No light, no tunnel, no revelation, just nothing. Then he added, and I am paraphrasing but barely, that if you are thinking of dying, to find out what is on the other side, he would not bother, because he had been there, and there was nothing to recommend it. That is the answer. 6 minutes of clinical death, and Kerry Packer came back with sarcasm and a renewed appreciation for being alive, without any of the spiritual transformation that the experience is supposed to produce. Did the heart attack change him? The honest answer, from everyone who knew him, is not really. Not at the level of his appetites, or his drives, or his willingness to sit down at a blackjack table and wager the GDP of a small nation on a single hand. He became perhaps slightly more aware of his physical limitations. He was more conscious of his health in the years that followed. He carried on, because that is what Kerry Packer did. He carried on, always toward the next game, the next deal, the next challenge, the next chance to sit across from the odds and remind them who they were dealing with. The end of the game, Kerry Packer's legacy. Kerry Packer died on December 26, 2005. He was 68 years old. The cause was kidney failure, a condition he had managed for years following a transplant. His death was not sudden in the way his cardiac arrest had been sudden. There was time. There was awareness. And then, quietly, on the day after Christmas, the biggest player Las Vegas had ever hosted put down his cards for the last time. His estate was valued at approximately 6.5 billion Australian dollars. His son James inherited the media and entertainment empire and went on to build his own story in the casino world, one that has its own shadows and its own complications. But that is a story for another episode. In Australia, Kerry Packer is remembered primarily as a media titan, the man who transformed Australian television, the man who took on the cricket establishment and won, the man who embarrassed a Senate committee and walked out of Canberra taller than when he walked in, the man who built and bought back and built again until the empire was so deeply his that it had taken on his personality entirely. In Las Vegas, the memory is different, quieter in some ways. The casino industry does not build monuments to the players who beat them. It does not hang portraits of the men who broke their cages. But in the back rooms, in the conversations between gaming executives and risk managers and veteran casino hosts. The name Kerry Packer carries a specific weight. He is the benchmark for conversations about maximum exposure, about cage capitalization, about what happens when a player exists entirely outside your normal parameters. He is the reason certain protocols were written. He is the reason certain assumptions were revised. He is the reason the phrase "another Kerry Packer situation" became shorthand in gaming circles for something that had never been planned for and probably could not be. What was Kerry Packer? Really? I have been sitting with that question since I started researching this story, and I keep arriving at the same answer. He was his father's son, in every way Frank Packer dreaded. He took everything Frank built and made it unrecognizably larger. He took every piece of cruelty Frank had delivered and turned it into fuel. He built an empire, sold it perfectly, bought it back brilliantly, and then took the money to Las Vegas and won so much in a single night that one of the most powerful casino companies in the world had to wire in emergency cash just to cover what he had taken from their tables. He was clinically dead for 6 minutes and came back with nothing to report. He tipped a cocktail waitress $1 million because he could. He told a boastful Texan he would flip him for everything he was worth and meant every word of it. He was, in the fullest possible sense, a force of nature in a suit. A man shaped by damage and driven by something that even he probably could not fully name. Not quite love of gambling, not quite need for validation. Something older and harder and more fundamental than either of those things. The need to prove, one hand at a time, that the odds were not the boss of him. And in Las Vegas, across countless tables and uncountable chips, Kerry Francis Bullmore Packer proved it better than anyone who ever sat down to play. The house always wins. Unless Kerry Packer is in the house. If you've ever been to a casino and felt that specific electricity in the air when someone is on an extraordinary run, tell me about it in the comments. I want to hear your stories. And if you love discovering the real legends behind the neon, the men and women who shaped Las Vegas into what it is, then hit subscribe, because every legend had a story, and we're just getting started.